Hello and welcome to week 3 of the psychology of personality. And a little apology, I had some video editing issues I ran into. I wasn't able to get to finishing this video until now. Here I am Tuesday night putting this together. So let's take some time and look at what's coming up this week in our third week of class. Let's take a look at the course book. This is kind of what I'll be doing from this point on. So here's, we're in chapter 3, introducing you to a person you've probably heard of before, a person named Sigmund Freud. Now, you'll read a little bit about him here, but if you ever have a chance to take a history of psychology class and learn a little bit about the history, not only of Freud himself, but the time in which he lived, some of the stuff, sort of makes sense, but he is certainly known for having some peculiarities with himself, his personality, and certainly as it revealed in his theory. But he did basically popularize the idea of psychology in a great way, and much of what we have in the history of psychology is either Freudian in nature or it's reactions to Freud, so that he was a catalyst for science in psychology nonetheless. So as we start learning about Freud and his personality theory, here I bring you to the little picture of the Freud Museum, which is in London, where he spent the last year of his life escaping from the Nazi situation in Germany. And you can go and visit that if you're ever in London, or you can visit virtually. We're going to be learning about his idea of psychic determinism, probably one of the more interesting, useful, but yet controversial theories that he's come up with. We'll look at what he thought about anxiety and an example of one of the characteristics that he worked with when he was working with his patients, and that is the Freudian slip. So we go into who was Sigmund Freud, kind of the father of so many things, and his basic concepts, trying to understand Freud from the point of view that he's working as a physician in a hospital. And what he really brought to the field was the notion that he was the first to really sit down and actually listen to what the patients were saying. So he kind of invented psychotherapy in a way. And if you took that history class, you would realize that, in fact, when those people who were in the hospital began telling him stories of the horrors that they had gone through as children when they were abused, Freud believed them. When he published this, that he had found out that the reason why all these people were having such troubles as adults was because of early childhood trauma, he was essentially made a laughingstock, and he was not able to tolerate that, and his failure was that he resorted to saying that these were not real, but they were fantasies, and then, basically set psychology back 75, 100 years. But a lot of what he brought to the field had to do with this term of psychic determinism, that early childhood events, fantasies, in his theory, but yet if they really occurred or early trauma or whatnot impacted people later on. That was a concept that was known, but it really wasn't brought to the front until someone of his stature was able to bring that to the public, and people really latched onto that. In terms of understanding human beings, he was very influenced by the work of Charles Darwin and talked about human beings having instincts. He talks about that. We look at his understanding of the personality and consciousness, that he felt that a lot of people were not conscious of these inner motivations, and that psychoanalysis, the methodology that he created, was a way to reveal those hidden parts of the personality, where you'll be introduced to the parts of the personality, the id, the ego, and the superego. We are mostly aware of ego, that's the I, and the id and the superego are largely subconscious and unconscious, and we're not aware of them. He felt that a lot of the things that happen in our lives, such as Freudian slips, are things that reveal these hidden desires of the id and possibly these kind of like controlling factors of maybe an overdeveloped superego, that he thought each one of those, an outrageous id where people are just doing whatever they want, and an over-controlling superego, which is like the over-controlling aspects of society and rules and whatnot, that'd be a kind of a neurotic individual, maybe a obsessive compulsive disorder and stuff like that. He thought that those characteristics of the personality were the driving forces of a person's being and how they experience. We picture this in the modern society as the little devil, the id, and the angel, the superego, and the ego, kind of like in contrast. And anxiety itself arose from these inner conflicts between what they really want to do and what society is telling them not to do. And the lifespan, he's considered the father of lifespan development as well, the developmental psych. The lifespan is that continual battle between the self-serving, self-centered id and the external learned control mechanisms from our society, what he termed the superego. So that's a lot of what we have for Freud here. In terms of our assessments, we have a couple discussions. The first is to talk about this psychic determinism. To what degree do you agree with this idea that when we're young, those early events impact us later on? Little thing about the Freudian slip, discussing that. And then the quiz is a one-question quiz, considering his explanation of anxiety as being the result of the ego being overwhelmed by the need to resolve the difference between the id and the superego. Perhaps you can understand this when you're in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, those kind of things that you're probably aware of too. Now this week, moving right along, this is a 2-chapter week. We are also going to be looking at Alfred Adler and the work of Harry Stack Sullivan, mostly Adler. Adler is a big, huge influence on early psychology. He was a student of Freud, rejected his ideas in favor of a model that focused more on social interactions. So if we're going to take a look at chapter 4, and in the attention section, we actually are introduced to one of Adler's more popular theories, and that is the concept of birth order. When we think about the oldest, middle child, and youngest child syndrome, and if you may have even heard of that, that came from Adler's work. Now, interestingly enough, data fails to support that theory. Fails to, when we actually look at the personality development of the oldest, middle, and youngest child, there's not these consistent differences that were described by Adler. I will tell you, however, that despite the fact that there's all that data that doesn't support it, my own family was 3 brothers, oldest, middle, youngest, and we are so textbook Adlerian. It's not even funny. My oldest brother, very responsible, took over when my father left us. My middle brother was kind of like the wild person, got into more trouble than anybody else, although the oldest brother did try to compete with him on that. And and he was sort of lost for a long time. And then there's me. I was the spoiled brat as a child, and notice how I make a distinction as a child. I'm not spoiled anymore, I guess. And we were very stereotypical, what Adler would call that particular family structure. Now, Alfred Adler himself, as you will learn, started studying psychology, but growing up, he was a very sickly child. And so, as we will see, again, kind of referring to that history of psychology, when you look at the history of some of these theories, the theories that these famous psychologists came up with were largely a result of their life experiences. So you have Freud, who had kind of a strange developmental, sexually oriented, there's a lot more to it than that. But sexually oriented, survival-based sort of things that were a part of his upbringing and whatnot. And his work as a physician greatly shaped what he came up with. Adler was actually a very sickly child. And so it stands to reason he would come up with a field called individual psychology, separated from Freud, and talked about feelings of inferiority and superiority, and that through social interactions with people, the development and expression of the personality is a negotiation of relative inferiority and superiority, both healthy inferiority and superiority, relation to your peers, but then also in the unhealthy realm in terms of when that becomes out of control. He talked about things like compensation. So if you weren't really feeling like you were as good at something as somebody else, you worked that much harder, or you found another avenue that you could excel at. And there's all this driving aspect of the personality there. Now, he also discussed the concept of a style of life. And when we look in the textbook, we see this. It's the style of life is created by the challenges that people encounter. And this is so modern. This idea is so contemporary that we really feel that, my challenges are what make me who I am today. There's many people, many of you will probably say some of the very most important experiences I've had that shape who I am come from the difficulties that I've had. And it's very much an Adlerian concept. So, and that develops a style of life, a life plan about how I'm going to overcome. And you see how that plays into Adler's early development as a sickly child and overcoming until he had his own successes. I provide a couple examples. One person that I don't know, Randy Kurse, but then Enoch Glidden, a friend of mine, is featured in the course book. He's a person who was born with spina bifida, and I got to know him through various interactions. He was also a student for a short time at KVCC, and he uses a wheelchair to get around, and boy does he. He does mountain climbing, he does skydiving, he does off-road wheelchair downhill racing, which is scary to watch, like cantilevered wheels, tilting, spraying dirt. His limitations based on his spina bifida have certainly not kept him from excelling in any way. A great individual. Harry Stack Sullivan, on the other hand, was very closely associated with Adler, but he felt that this inferiority, superiority thing, this accomplishment and all that wasn't even that important. What's important is establishing social interactions. And we start seeing this idea of I am who I hang around with, kind of thing. So here we have this, this social comparison thing that was going on with Adler, and that I achieve my personality by overcoming the barriers in my life. And then we have this other theory that comes along and says, yeah, we do that with the social interactions, but at the end of the day, it's our social community that really defines who we are and the way we interact, because that's the way our personality expresses itself. I mean, if we were on a deserted island, where would our personality be? Other than, maybe how we problem solve and all that stuff that's more cognitive, but our personality really exists within social interactions. So kind of a different slant on that. It was very interesting. So very, very good point of view there. As we venture into the assessments for this particular chapter, we have one discussion, one quiz. We talk about Adler's theory. Let's discuss some of this idea of striving for superiority and whatnot, and how do you make a good life? How did you get over those barriers that you had? We can talk about those things. In the quiz, I have you do a little bit of that same thing in quiz format. How would you describe your style of life? And then Adler's view on inferiority and superiority. Contrast that with Harry Stack Sullivan's view of the personality, focused mostly on interpersonal security, having that sense of belonging. with the group and how that defines our personality. So a little long-winded, almost like a lecture. This is really cool. So enjoy this week. Sorry this is a little late. I'm going to endeavor to make these right on Monday morning for next time. So have a great week, and I'll see you in the discussions.